Welcome to SEDF 704, Diversity in Adolescent Development. In today's lecture, we'll discuss how biological changes in the brain and body shape the adolescent experience, and how those changes interact with diverse factors like gender, race, culture, ability, and language background. The thoughts, feelings, and behaviors we associate with adolescence don't just emerge. Profound, complex changes in the nervous and endocrine systems activate them. The adolescent brain is developing new learning and reflection capacities, signaling the body to grow, change, and mature. These changes affect how adolescents look and how they think, regulate emotion, handle stress, and form identity. In this session, we'll begin with an overview of how the brain and nervous systems work, then explore how hormonal shifts signal physical transformation and shape emotional development. Finally, we'll consider how diversity affects these biological processes, how they are perceived, experienced, and supported differently across students' social and cultural contexts. Understanding what's happening under the surface helps us interpret adolescent behavior with more clarity, empathy, and insight, especially when we're supporting students from a wide range of backgrounds. Let's begin with a foundational idea. Everything psychological is simultaneously biological. Our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors are not separate from the body. They are expressions of it. To fully understand adolescent development, we need to ground ourselves in three core foundations: evolutionary theories and genetics, anatomy and physiology, and human development across the lifespan. These frameworks help explain how the adolescent brain and body work, and more importantly, why they work the way they do. From an evolutionary perspective, the brain and body were shaped to solve problems of survival and reproduction. Evolutionary psychology starts with two central assumptions. The genes that guide human development today are the result of natural selection. They helped our ancestors survive and pass on their traits. And two, the human nervous system develops according to a biological recipe encoded in those genes, but expressed through interaction with the environment. This means that human development, including adolescence, is not random. From an evolutionary perspective, human traits are shaped by natural selection to solve problems of survival and reproduction. Our genetic code reflects thousands of years of adaptation to different environments, and the nervous system, especially the brain, develops according to a biological plan that is both inherited and environmentally responsive. Human genetic material composition is the product of variations associated with parentage and environment. This means that your genetic makeup, the unique combination of DNA you carry, comes from two sources. Parentage, you inherit half of your genetic material from each biological parent. This inheritance determines a wide range of traits, from eye color to the likelihood of early or late puberty. And environment. While genes provide the instructions, the expression of those genes, whether they're turned on, off, or moderated, can be shaped by environmental factors. This is called gene-environment interaction. For example, someone might have a genetic predisposition for tall stature, but without proper nutrition during childhood, that trait might not fully develop. Traits associated with adaptation to environment result from natural selection. Over thousands of generations, humans have evolved traits that help us survive and reproduce in specific environments. These are called adaptive traits. Natural selection is the process by which the traits that improve an organism's chances of survival or reproduction are more likely to be passed to future generations. For example, early humans who had a better memory may have been more successful at locating food or avoiding danger. Those who formed strong social bonds may have been better protected in groups. These traits, if genetically influenced, would have been passed on more frequently, shaping the human brain over time. Physical traits that aid in survival and reproduction, i.e. fitness, of offspring are passed on. In evolutionary terms, fitness does not mean athletic ability. It refers to reproductive success. If a physical or behavioral trait increases the likelihood that a person will survive long enough to reproduce and that their offspring will also survive, then that trait is more likely to persist in the population. For instance, traits like strong immune systems, the ability to regulate stress, or efficient energy use might increase survival chances. Traits like sexual maturation timing, body symmetry, or emotional bonding tendencies may influence mate selection or parenting success. Over time, these traits become more common in the population, not because they're better, but because they've improved chances of reproducing in a given environment. Evolutionary psychologists believe that most psychological traits originally evolved because they served a purpose, helping our ancestors survive or reproduce. Traits like empathy, fear, social bonding, or even risk-taking had a value in ancient environments. This perspective offers two kinds of explanations. The distal explanation looks at the original evolutionary purpose of a trait, why a trait might have evolved in an ancestral past. It must have had some benefit in an evolutionary term, or it wouldn't have been naturally selected. For example, empathy might have evolved to promote cooperation and group survival. Proximal explanations look at how that trait functions today, describe their immediate mechanisms that trigger or regulate that trait now, regardless of whether it's currently adaptive or not. It does not have to be beneficial today. It just needs to explain how or why the trait is expressed in the present. Empathy now helps adolescents build friendships, resolve conflict, and connect socially. Even if the original survival advantage is no longer relevant in modern life, the trait may still serve important social or emotional functions. We can see the impact of both biology and environment in the secular trend in monarchy, the long-term population level decline in the average age at which girls experience their first menstruation. In the mid-19th century, the average age of monarchy in Western countries was around 16 to 17 years old. Today, it is closer to 12 to 13. This change is largely attributed to improved nutrition, healthcare, and overall living conditions, all of which support earlier physical development. However, this trend is not driven by biology alone. Environmental stressors can also accelerate puberty. For example, family conflict, trauma, or the absence of a biological father have all been associated with earlier menarche. From an evolutionary psychology perspective, these patterns may reflect adaptive responses in unstable environments. The body may respond by reaching reproductive maturity sooner, increasing the chances of passing on genes before environmental risks interfere. Some researchers have suggested that earlier puberty might once have helped adolescents seek independence or support in unstable environments. In modern settings, however, earlier maturation often exposes adolescents to greater risks rather than benefits, highlighting how an evolved trait may no longer serve its original purpose in the same way. In environments where long-term stability or safety is uncertain due to conflict, neglect, or absent caregivers, early physical maturity may subconsciously prompt the adolescent to seek new alliances, resources, or protections elsewhere. This might look like increased peer affiliation, earlier romantic relationships, or leaving the home earlier. So in modern terms, the proximal expression of early puberty might open social doors, albeit with complex or risky consequences. Now let's turn to the question, how does the brain communicate with the rest of the body? The human body has two main communication systems that keeps everything running in sync, the nervous system and the endocrine system. Right now, let's focus on the nervous system, a fast, highly specialized communication network that uses electrical and chemical signals to transmit information throughout the body. The nervous system has two major parts: the central nervous system, made up of the brain and spinal cord, which act as the command center, and the peripheral nervous system, which includes all the nerves that branch out from the central nervous system to the rest of the body. Let's walk through a simple everyday example of how the nervous system coordinates brain and body communication. Imagine you're feeling thirsty and you see a glass of water on the table. Your brain not only recognizes the glass, but also tells your arm to reach out for it and drink. This is a classic stimulus response pathway, and it involves three main types of neurons. Sensory neurons. These neurons carry information from your sensory organs to your brain. In this case, light enters your eyes, and the visual information is sent to the brain through sensory neurons, allowing you to recognize the glass. Relay neurons. These neurons connect neurons within your central nervous system. They process the incoming sensory information and decide what to do next. Your brain quickly interprets the image, confirms that you're thirsty, and decides to reach out for the glass. The motor neurons. These neurons carry signals from the brain to your muscles. Once the brain decides to act, it sends signals through motor neurons to the muscles in your shoulder, arm, and hand, telling them to reach out, grasp the glass, and bring it to your mouth. This seamless sequence, seeing, deciding, and acting, happens in fractions of a second and is repeated thousands of times a day, from picking up a pencil to walking across a room. Now that we know what neurons do, let's take a closer look at how they're structured and how they communicate with each other. A neuron is a specialized cell designed to send and receive messages. Each neuron has three main parts: the dendrites, which receive incoming signals from other neurons, the cell body, or soma, which processes those signals, and the axon, which carries the message away from the cell body towards the next neuron. But here's an important part. Neurons don't actually touch each other. There's a tiny gap between them called the synapse. The synapse is made out of the terminal button of the end of one neuron's axon, the synaptic space, the small gap between the neurons, and the dendrites or cell body of the next neuron. When a neuron becomes excited, usually because it's receiving enough input from its neighbors, it fires an electrical impulse that travels down the axon to the terminal button. There, electrical signals trigger the release of neurotransmitters, chemical messengers that cross the synaptic gap and bind to receptors in the next neuron. If the receiving neuron is stimulated enough, it also fires, and the message continues down the line. This process is incredibly fast and happens constantly. It's how you form your thoughts, move your muscles, feel emotions, and remember everything you just heard. As I mentioned, neurotransmitters are the chemical messengers that allow neurons to communicate. In adolescence, the brain is especially sensitive to changes in neurotransmitter activity, which helps explain a lot about the emotional highs and lows, shifting attention, and increased risk-taking we often see during this stage. A few neurotransmitters play particularly important roles. Dopamine is involved in motivation, movement, and reward. During adolescence, dopamine levels spike in ways that make teens more sensitive to reward and novelty, which drives curiosity but also drives risky behavior. Too much or too little dopamine is also associated with serious mental health conditions like schizophrenia and Parkinson's disease. Serotonin helps regulate mood, sleep, and appetite. Low serotonin levels are linked to depression, something that becomes especially relevant in adolescence as rates of mood disorders begin to increase. Norepinephrine helps control alertness and attention. It's involved in the body's stress and response, and low levels can also contribute to mood issues. The balance of neurotransmitters, not just their presence, is key. An oversupply or undersupply can disrupt normal development, and adolescence is a period when the brain's chemical systems are still finding that balance. Because the adolescent brain is still developing and especially sensitive to neurotransmitter changes, it's also more vulnerable to the effects of drugs and other substances. Whether we're talking about medications, controlled substances, or narcotics, these compounds interfere with normal neural communication in significant ways. There are three main ways drugs can alter how neurons work. Agonists mimic neurotransmitters and stimulate neurons to fire even when they normally wouldn't. Antagonists block receptor sites, preventing neurons from firing, and reuptake inhibitors prevent the recycling of neurotransmitters, increasing the amount of chemical in the synapse. Let's look at a few common substances that affect adolescent brains. Nicotine acts as an acetylcholine agonist, stimulating receptors that increase dopamine release. That rush of dopamine reinforces use, especially in younger users. As of 2023, over 10% of high school students and 5% of middle schoolers reported current use of tobacco products. Alcohol is both an agonist and an antagonist. It enhances GABA, slowing brain function, and inhibits glutamate, which affects memory and learning. Adolescents who drink are especially vulnerable to impaired decision-making and long-term memory deficits. Nearly 20% of youth ages 14 to 15 reported drinking in their lifetime. Marijuana, or THC, acts as a cannabinoid agonist, altering perception and increasing dopamine. Chronic use during adolescence has been linked to reduced attention, motivation, and long-term cognitive changes. In 2022, nearly 31% of 12th graders reported cannabis use in the past year, and over 6% reported daily use. These substances can reshape how adolescent brains respond to reward, stress, and emotion, and because of the brain's plasticity during this stage, some of those changes can last well into adulthood. These substances don't just alter brain chemistry at the moment, they also impact adolescent brain development, particularly in areas of the frontal cortex and limbic system, which are still maturing. This disruption can lead to increased risk-taking, greater vulnerability to addiction, poor emotional regulation, and even long-term cognitive effects that persist into adulthood. We'll take a closer look at those brain regions and their developmental trajectories next, because to understand why teens think and act the way they do, we need to understand how their brains are still under construction. The central nervous system is made up of the brain and the spinal cord, and it acts as the body's control center. It processes all incoming sensory information, makes decisions, and sends out instructions to the rest of the body. The brain itself can be divided into three major regions with different functions. The hindbrain, which is the most basic, evolutionarily ancient part of the brain. It includes the brainstem and the cerebellum, and it's responsible for automatic life-sustaining functions like breathing, heart rate, and coordination. The midbrain acts as a relay station, helping process visual and auditory information and coordinate movement. It also plays a role in arousal and alertness. And the forebrain. The forebrain is the most advanced region, especially in humans. It includes the cerebral cortex, limbic system, thalamus, and hypothalamus. The forebrain is responsible for thinking, decision-making, emotion, memory, and sensory processing. All the things that really ramp up during adolescence. As adolescents grow, these regions, especially the forebrain, are developing rapidly, but not all at the same pace, and that mismatch helps explain a lot of what we see during this stage. Let's take a closer look at the forebrain, the most complex and developmentally important region of the brain, especially during adolescence. The forebrain includes the cerebrum, thalamus, and limbic system, which itself contains the hypothalamus, amygdala, and hippocampus. These structures work together to support everything from logic and planning to emotion and memory. We'll start with the cerebrum, the largest part of the brain. It's divided into two halves called hemispheres, left and right, which are connected by a thick band of fibers called the corpus callosum. This allows both sides of the brain to share information and coordinate activity. Covering the cerebrum is the cerebral cortex, the wrinkled outer layer of the brain. This is where higher level thinking happens: problem solving, language, conscious thought, and decision making. The cortex is still developing well into a person's mid-20s, and in adolescence, it's one of the regions undergoing intense reorganization and refinement. The cerebral cortex is divided into 4 major regions or lobes, each with its own specialized function. Understanding what each lobe does helps us make sense of how adolescents think, learn, and respond to their environment. The frontal lobe is located behind the forehead. It's often called the executive center of the brain, and it's responsible for decision making, problem solving, planning, impulse control, emotional regulation, and goal-oriented behavior. This is the last area of the brain to fully mature, often not until the mid-20s, which explains why adolescents may often act impulsively, take unnecessary risks, or struggle with long-term planning. The prefrontal cortex part of the frontal lobe plays a critical role in self-regulation and is deeply tied to identity, motivation, and learning. Located at the top and toward the back of the brain, the parietal lobe processes sensory information from the body, like touch, temperature, and spatial awareness. It helps adolescents coordinate movement, understand their body and space, and integrate sensory input. This lobe also plays a role in math and spatial reasoning, which become increasingly important as academic demands grow. Found near the temples and behind the ears, the temporal lobe is involved in hearing, language comprehension, and memory. It processes auditory information and helps adolescents understand and produce speech. It also houses the hippocampus, a key structure for long-term memory formation, which is why it's essential for learning. Located in the back of the brain is the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe is the brain's visual processing center. It interprets signals from the eyes and helps us understand shapes, colors, movement, and spatial relationships. While this lobe matures earlier than the frontal lobe, it plays a critical role in helping adolescents navigate their visual environment, both academic, like reading and graphs, but social, like facial expressions or body language. Together, these 4 lobes interact constantly, forming the complex network that powers everything from academic performance to emotional intelligence. Now that we've covered what the lobes do, it's important to understand that these regions, especially the frontal lobe, are still under construction in adolescence. As I mentioned, the frontal lobe is one of the last brain areas to fully mature. This explains a lot in the inconsistencies we see in teens, that they might be insightful and self-aware one day and impulsive or emotionally reactive the next. At the same time, the adolescent brain is highly plastic. Neuroplasticity refers to the brain's remarkable ability to adapt, reorganize, and build new connections, especially in response to new experiences, learning, and challenges. This is a critical window. The brain is primed to grow, but it's also vulnerable. Another important change during this time is synaptic pruning. In early childhood, the brain overproduces synaptic connections. In adolescence, it begins to trim away the unused ones and strengthen the most frequently used pathways, sort of like updating the brain's wiring. The term use it or lose it becomes very real during adolescence. Skills and behaviors teens practice, whether positive like problem solving or negative like anxiety patterns, are the ones reinforced neurologically. Because these areas are so specialized, damage to specific lobes can lead to specific kinds of impairments. For example, damage to the frontal lobe can result in poor emotional regulation, difficulty with planning and time management, and trouble forming speech or even motor impairments. A famous example of frontal lobe damage is Phineas Gage, who after frontal lobe injury from a railroad spike, Gage survived but underwent dramatic personality changes, becoming impulsive, irritable, and socially inappropriate. Damage to the parietal lobe can cause deficits in abstract reasoning, spatial awareness, and body orientation. Fine motor control may also be affected. Damage to the occipital lobe can lead to visual processing issues, vision loss, trouble recognizing faces, and in some cases, seizures and hallucinations. Since the temporal lobe is involved in language and memory, Damage can lead to difficulty forming or recalling memories and trouble interpreting emotional cues in others. Notably, CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, a condition seen in athletes with repeated head trauma, often involves protein buildup in the temporal lobe. Now let's zoom in on a few key structures in the forebrain that play a central role in adolescent development, especially during puberty. This is where hormones start influencing not just the body, but also the mind. The forebrain is where puberty hormones like estrogen and testosterone begin to influence higher order thinking, motivation, and emotional regulation. These hormones don't just affect the body, but they also impact how adolescents feel, think, and interact with others. The hypothalamus is like the brain's internal thermostat and hormone switchboard. It plays a major role in triggering puberty by sending signals to the pituitary gland. It also regulates circadian rhythms, your internal clock, appetite, and sexual behavior. In adolescence, the hypothalamus becomes more active, helping set the stage for physical, emotional, and behavioral shifts. Sometimes called the master gland, the pituitary takes its cues from the hypothalamus and begins releasing hormones into the bloodstream. This includes hormones that stimulate the gonads, the ovaries and testes, to produce testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone. These sex hormones drive physical changes like growth spurts and sexual maturation, but they also interact with the brain, influencing everything from energy levels to emotional reactivity. The amygdala is the brain's emotional processing center, especially for fear, threat, and social cues. During adolescence, hormones intensify the amygdala's response to emotional stimuli. This can lead to heightened sensitivity to stress or perceived slights, stronger emotional reactions, increased risk-taking behavior, especially in social settings. In short, the amygdala is working overtime, but the prefrontal cortex, which is supposed to regulate it, is still catching up. And this imbalance is the key reason adolescents can feel so emotionally intense. The hippocampus is essential for memory formation and spatial navigation. It helps adolescents form long-term memories and integrate new experiences with existing knowledge. During adolescence, the hippocampus is rapidly developing, which contributes to improvements in learning and recall, greater ability to reflect on past experiences, and increased capacity for narrative identity, the ability to tell a coherent story about who you are. However, stress hormones like cortisol, which are also elevated during puberty, can temporarily disrupt hippocampal function, making it harder to concentrate or retain new information during periods of emotional upheaval, which can be brought upon through family dynamics or other relationships. Why does this matter? The limbic system, which includes the hypothalamus, pituitary gland, amygdala, and hippocampus, is hyperactive during adolescence. It processes emotion, motivation, stress, and social feedback, all while the frontal cortex, which regulates it, is still under construction. This mismatch helps explain emotional up and downs, mood swings and reactivity, increased sensitivity to social rejection, and a stronger drive for novelty, autonomy, and peer connection. Adolescents aren't being irrational or dramatic on purpose. Their brains are literally wired to experience the world more intensely during this stage. In addition to handling thinking and memory, now let's turn our attention to the physical changes that happen during adolescence. These changes are driven by a surge of hormonal activity primarily regulated by the pituitary gland and the gonads. They shape everything from body size to sexual maturity. One of the most visible signs of puberty is the adolescent growth spurt, a rapid increase in height and weight. For girls, this typically begins around age 10 and peaks at about 12, and it's usually complete by ages 15 to 16. For boys, it starts a bit later, around age 12. It peaks around 14 and finishes by ages 17 to 18. This growth doesn't always happen smoothly. Many adolescents experience what's called asynchronicity of growth, meaning different parts of the body grow at different rates. That's why you might see teens with long legs and big feet, but still childlike faces, or vice versa. Adolescents also go through predictable process of sexual maturation, which includes the development of primary sex characteristics like reproductive organs and secondary sex characteristics like breast development, voice changes, and body hair. While both sexes follow an established sequence, it's important to note male sexual maturation tends to be less externally noticeable in early stages than in females. Girls' puberty often draws more social attention due to the visible changes like breast development and menstruation. These physical changes don't just affect the body, they also impact how adolescents are perceived by others and how they see themselves. And because puberty timing varies across individuals and populations, these experiences are often shaped by gender, race, culture, and social norms. Hormones don't just affect the body, they interact with the brains in ways that shape cognition, mood, and stress responses. One hormone that increases during this time is oxytocin, often called the bonding hormone. This rise of oxytocin makes adolescents more attuned to social feedback, which can deepen relationships, but can also increase sensitivity to rejection, embarrassment, and peer pressure. Further, adolescents also have a heightened stress response. When faced with pressure, whether academic, social, or family related, the brain triggers the release of cortisol, the primary stress hormone. High cortisol levels in adolescence are linked to anxiety, mood instability, sleep disturbances, and increased emotional reactivity. Adding to this challenge, puberty causes a shift in melatonin release, which delays sleep onset. That's why many teens naturally stay up later and struggle to wake up early, even if they're exhausted. Together, these hormonal effects contribute to the landscape where adolescents are learning, growing, and adapting, but also navigating biological volatility that can make regulation difficult. So why did we spend so much time on neurons, hormones, and brain anatomy? Because adolescence is not just a biological phase, it's a biological phase that unfolds differently for every student, depending who they are and where they come from. Everything we've discussed, puberty, emotional regulation, risk-taking, and even sleep patterns, is shaped not just by age, but by lived experience. Diversity isn't separate from biology, it interacts with it, amplifies it, and in some cases, reshapes it. First, let's discuss timing of puberty and how that varies by context. Race, ethnicity, nutrition, family stress, and socioeconomic status all influence the onset of puberty. For example, African American or Black girls in the United States tend to experience menarche earlier than their white peers. It is suggested that this is due to both environmental and systemic factors. Earlier puberty can influence social perception, academic expectations, and increase exposure to risk. We also know that stress hormones are responsive to the environment. High cortisol levels are linked to chronic stress from poverty, racism, discrimination, and family instability, and these stressors disproportionately affect marginalized adolescents. Chronic stress can alter brain development, especially in areas responsible for learning and regulation. In terms of disability and neurodivergence, adolescents with physical disabilities or neurodevelopmental conditions like ADHD and autism may experience different hormonal and neural pathways. They might respond differently to classroom stimuli or stress and navigate puberty with fewer tailored supports. Understanding biology helps us interpret behavior and design better accommodations or become better advocates. In terms of gender and puberty experience, not all adolescents experience puberty in the same ways. For some, the physical changes of puberty may be misaligned with their self-perception, especially if they feel discomfort with traditional gender roles or expectations. These experiences may lead to heightened stress, social withdrawal, or emotional conflict. School environments that acknowledge individual differences in gender expression without assuming a one-size-fits-all development may reduce stigma and misunderstanding. So, understanding that puberty feels different for different students can help educators interpret behavior more thoughtfully and help provide supportive, positive engagement. Further, cultural beliefs influence biological interpretation. Different communities interpret puberty, menstruation, and emotional expression in culturally specific ways. These interpretations shape how adolescents understand their bodies and whether they feel supported or ashamed. Educators benefit from being culturally responsive to how biology is framed and experienced. Adolescence is a time of massive neurological and hormonal transformation. Understanding how brain and body work together and how these systems are shaped by experience, stress, and culture can help educators better support diverse students during this critical developmental period. Diversity factors like race, gender, culture, ability, and language background don't just influence external experiences. They shape the body's stress responses, hormone regulation, and even brain architecture. Biology gives us the groundwork, but diversity determines how that groundwork is interpreted, challenged, and supported. In our next session, we'll shift from biology to cognition. We'll explore key theories of cognitive development and how changes in adolescent thinking, reasoning, decision-making, and self-reflection help us better understand their learning. These frameworks will give us a deeper lens for interpreting student behavior and supporting cognitive growth in diverse classrooms. Thanks for spending this time with me exploring how psychological theory and diversity shape adolescent development. If you're in the course, make sure to check the syllabus and weekly announcements for updates and assignments. If you're just visiting, thanks for stopping by. I hope you'll check out other videos in this playlist or elsewhere on the Stats with Torah's YouTube channel. Wishing you the best in your educational pursuits. Until next time, ciao!